And if you're trying to do video, it's not showing up for some reason.
Yeah, I need to. Oh, give me a second.
Oh, wow. At any rate, we are officially live. I see us showing up on YouTube. So, GM fam, happy Friday to everybody. Another wild, wild week in cryptocurrency, as always. And so, just for some context, about a couple of months ago, I was pinging today's guest of honor, which is Gabe Shapiro of many, many things, general counsel at Delphi Labs, I believe one of, if not the founder or progenitor of the Lex Army, Lex Punk DAO, the entire Lex organization, which is like this radical crypto law group. But like 2 months ago, I was like, there's a lot of stuff going on in like the wild world of crypto law. Why don't we see if we can get someone on to talk about it? So I pinged Gabe, and Gabe was like, "Oh, sir, I'd like to, but I'm busy. But don't worry, I'm sure like by the end of the month there will be more legal things." And then in that time, we had the Coinbase stuff, Do Kwon, Uki DAO, like just a torrent of crazy legal stuff happening. So just as you predicted, there has been a ton of crazy legal stuff. So I'm glad you could finally join us to talk.
Right on. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So just quickly before we get going, a couple of disclaimers that we want to get out of the way. For starters, of course, none of this financial advice, none of this is legal advice. And I do not know how I got here. It's probably added by a third party. Anything, you know, the usual Discord prayer applies as usual. As a lawyer, does that actually work? If you copy paste that into a Discord server, are you absolved of everything?
No, definitely not. Yeah, I actually post that copy pasta a lot because I think it's so funny. But yeah, it doesn't do anything.
So you're saying that if Do Kwon posted that, he wouldn't have gotten off the hook?
Complete exoneration, clearly.
It's like bulletproof, right? Well, I feel a little bad for
That's
you
right.
because you've been on an absolute tear lately in terms of like the podcasts you've been joining. Because you got to be with Laura Shin, you had the podcast with Hester Purse lately. I feel like you're going from like the A team down to like the D list here.
No, no, no. It's all fun.
But yeah, super happy to have you because I mean, like, I I feel like crypto law is like the most interesting issue going on right now. But I feel like very few people actually understand it. But you're really at the forefront of it, I'd say.
I try to be. Yeah.
Is it your sense that like there's definitely a few other lawyers that like I feel like embody this like kind of like awesome ethos. Most of them are in the Lex Style. But is it your opinion that it's like that's just like what maybe like 1-2% of the entire legal community and like 98% are just kind of like rubber stamps? Or what's your take on the legal
Uh,
industry in
I, I,
general?
I don't. Well, it's a little bit bifurcated, or maybe like trifurcated, or something like that. Like I think there are many people who just do rubber stamps, to be honest, because as well, especially as like a youth lawyer, it's a lot to become a lawyer, and you have to be trained and you have to pass the bar, and so it doesn't tend to encourage people who are just like mindless, and of course you can also face liability for bad advice. So I think everyone is thoughtful, but people have different ethoses and different reasons why they do what they do, right? I definitely think for some people it's uh it's a job more than a mission, like they have a very specific like job to do, which is represent the interests of the particular client that is paying them, and that's what they focus on. And then I think there are some others, and I sort of put myself in this category that are the mission oriented toward crypto, and like try to yes, I'm representing a particular client, but I also kind of see myself as representing a movement at the same time. So I try to pick clients who see the situation the same way, and that tends to produce a little bit of a different mentality and sometimes some different choices. I mean, a good example, right, is if a particular client is facing a regulatory action, and you have the chance to settle, but the settlement is going to like set the entire industry back. Do you settle or not, right? And that's obviously ultimately that is the client's choice, but I sort of hope to find clients that are more kind of like oriented toward the overall mission of DeFi and crypto and care about that rather than just kind of purely caring about their own self interest, I guess.
Right. That would be like the Kraken incident, right? Where the SEC was essentially saying, like, we're going to, basically throw as much firepower as we can behind attacking Kraken. And Kraken looked at it and said, like,
Right.
we'd like to fight, but if we look at it in terms of like fiduciary responsibility, there's no way we can afford to win this. So they're just settled, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, and they, the management of a public, or well, they're not public yet, but the management of a classic, American company like Kraken or Coinbase, whether it's public or trying to become public, uh, they have one and only one job, which is to make money for their stockholders. That is their legally mandated job. And I think a lot of corporations like to pretend that they have a broader mission, but ultimately, if they really wanted to have a broader mission, they would convert into some other type of entity, right? Like a public benefit corporation or a nonprofit. They're not that. They have to make economically rational decisions, and the economically rational decision there is to settle, even if it's kind of like worse for the industry overall and fighting.
Yeah, so it goes. But that's a good opportunity to bring up the first thing that I wanted to talk to you about, because I don't know like how long you'll be able to stick around for. Sometimes the internet kicks us out, but definitely want to talk about the newest thing you dropped. And I read it. Like I think that like I'm one of the only people who has managed to get through all 33 pages of this. But it was quite a read and really interesting stuff. The
Nice.
assimilating the Borg, a new framework for crypto law entities. Um, yeah, for those of us listening who haven't been able to get through all 33 pages, like why don't you give the like high level overview of this?
Sure. So, I've been playing around with DAOs and like doing little structuring for DAOs for a long time now. Sometimes I was doing it just kind of like for free out of interest, like in the very early days. So I came up with this sort of like, this like model DAO charter, which I think was one of the first like first ones, maybe the first one, where the idea of like having a constitution for a DAO, that achieved something legally, and that just had a very basic idea, which is just we're just gonna we have this code and we're just gonna defer to its outcome. So almost like enshrining code is law, but with a few sort of important exceptions. Like if there's some like major malfunction or whatever, then obviously you don't want to defer to it in that circumstance. uh and so my experimentation just kind of progressed from there. And what I've kind of noticed over time is that as more and more money has floated into the space, and DAOs have gotten bigger and bigger and more complex, there's a lot of legal risk with these DAOs. People we're always talking about the possibility that a DAO could be considered some type of unincorporated partnership, right? People could have joint and several liability and things like that. And we had this CFTC action recently, where they've actually been pursuing a DAO for alleged commodities law violations. And the way that a lot of people are reacting to this growing complexity and the increasing legal risks that are connected with that is to kind of like really pull back from what I consider the original idea of DAOs and say, we got to fix this. We got to protect people, need limited liability. So we're going to pass some laws that say, hey, a DAO can be a limited liability company, or a DAO can be unincorporated, but if it does certain state registrations and appoints a registered agent and files taxes and things like that, then then the members are going to get limited liability, and things of this sort. And to me, I just see that as it's not a DAO anymore, right? It's now just a new type of state registered entity, like a corporation, a limited liability partnership, a limited liability company, what have you. And I don't really get the point of calling that a DAO, right? It's certainly no longer autonomous because it depends on the state. Um, and Potentially it's not decentralized either, although though it might still be decentralized. So in sort of like reacting to this, I kind of want to like keep the dream of DAOs alive, and I really kind of thought about, okay, well, where are these legal risks arising from, right? And in my opinion, they're all arising from not leaving DAOs as DAOs, right? So I kind of went back to the original research on DAOs, which really was a series of articles in 20 what was it, 2016, I believe. No, even
2013.
earlier, like 2013. Yeah, exactly. Really by Stan Larimer, Dan Larimer, and Vitalik. And they had this idea that a DAO is a, a purely chain imminent type of entity. Yes, it is an entity, but it needs to be purely chain imminent, meaning all of its rules are on chain, all of them, right? All of the way that it pays for things is always in its own native token, right? And it's basically like intrinsically like transparent and sort of like only mutable within like very narrow bounds and like very trust reduced. Basically, as Stan Larimer puts it, it basically is a robot, right? And so if you focus on DAOs being that, I think, and sort of get away from this idea that like a venture fund can be a DAO, or these, like things like Wonderland, which are basically like, or Ohm, which are basically like giant on-chain, like diversified hedge funds that are investing in all these other tokens and things. If you get away from that and go back to this original pure idea that they are, on-chain robots, I think you can reduce a lot of the legal risk that people are worried about just from that. And then all these other things, right? Like the hedge fund, the security multi-sig, the like the people who like work, who like write the software, right? Uh, Instead of having them all be part of this, try to be part of this DAO, instead those are businesses. Those are social constructs. They require a lot of trust. They actually do require formal legal arrangements whenever you're paying someone in sort of an ordinary way, like not like you pay like Bitcoin pays Bitcoin miners, but like paying them in stable coins, right? And like making them into salaried workers and things like that. Those are businesses. So you put those into business entities, right? But you could still and I call those like DAO adjacent entities, right? But the key insight is that just because it's a business entity doesn't mean you have to do it in the ordinary way. You can sort of like put into the rules of the entity itself a mandate that the entity use specific smart contracts or what have you, and you can create checks and balances between that entity and the DAO. So now you've created like what I call a cybernetically enhanced organization, right? It has one foot in TradFi and one foot in DeFi, and it's this interesting hybrid. And with that, you can still do all the normal legal things. You can go get regulatory licenses. You can do tax withholding. You can enter into contracts, all these things, but you don't have to, do what's called wrapping the DAO in such a way that basically all the members of the DAO are going to have to be KYC'd, AML'd, and pay taxes and all these things. Instead, your DAO can be like Bitcoin itself or like Ethereum itself, which no one thinks like no one thinks all validators are in a common enterprise that needs to like pay taxes and stuff, even though they kind of are. So it could be like that, and then you have these entities that just have a certain like relationship to the DAO without the DAO certainly completely controlling it. So yeah, like ultimately you tie the law and the code together in like new and interesting ways to make these entities more accountable than the traditional. But that lets you keep like a DAO to be pure while also like ranging and doing these more aggressive sort of businessy things off chain.
Right. So basically, the DAOs themselves can just focus on being a DAO and doing the kind of hardcore, like
Yep,
on-chain cypherpunk stuff that they want to do. But then they can spin up
that's right.
these like robotic appendages that are the bridges, right? And you can encode within the Borgs. You could say that like this entity is legally required in its charter to like obey the votes of the DAO, for example, right?
That's right. Now, probably, that's going too far, right? Because now, like, literally that entity is just an agent of the DAO, and you have all the same regulatory issues. But what you can do is you could say, let's just take a very specific example, right? Like protocol controlled value, right? Or protocol owned value, it's sometimes called, right? Um, from a lawyer's perspective, and this is like where, for example, like Ohm sold tokens, right, and then took the proceeds of that and like locked it into liquidity pool for the tokens. And in this way, it kind of like built up a diversified treasury, and it like literally like characterized that as being owned by the protocol, which really means the governance token holders. And really, what you've created with this is like a giant on-chain hedge fund, and it's a regulatory nightmare. There's just no way to really make this legal in the way that they're doing, in my personal opinion. Not to try to get Ohm in trouble, but or Olympus Dow in trouble, but that's just how I see it. So instead, what you would do is you would form a Borg, you would form a legal entity, and you would have in the and that entity would own this liquidity, right? It would own the LP tokens, right? It would control them, and it wouldn't strictly work for the DAO, but it would have in its documents, and it would publish these documents, say, hey, we're literally just going to leave this liquidity in this pool. This entity owns it. We're leaving it there. We're a foundation. We're not for profit, and we're just going to leave it there. And the LP tokens are always going to be controlled by this specific multi-sig, and every director of this entity is going to be a member of that multi-sig. And if we ever want to, now the DAO doesn't own these tokens. The DAO can't decide to do something different with them by itself. But what you can do is you could say in the documents, this multi-sig has to be configured such that anytime we're going to change this, what we're doing with this liquidity, there's a time lock on that change, and the DAO can just veto it, right? So it's a little different from the DAO controlling it, right? But it does have this veto right, and that makes it sort of like accountable to the DAO in a looser way, right? Without sort of just being like a mere extension or agent of the DAO. So that'd be one example. And now you would no longer call it protocol controlled value or protocol owned value. You call it like protocol beneficial value, right? Something like that. But that entity could go, if it needs to get a VASP license, a virtual asset service provider license, which maybe it does in some jurisdictions, it could go get that license, right? And it doesn't mean that the DAO has to get that license, and every member of the DAO has to be KYC'd and evaluated by the regulator, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so one of the things I think is coolest about this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that like you're not saying anything that like needs a new framework to be built out, right? Like you don't need to wait for states to create Borg entities. You're basically just talking about
Correct.
reframing your thinking around these and kind of you're like clarifying the terms. So all that's needed is for the crypto community to be like, yeah, that's cool. We're gonna start calling it Borgs instead of DAOs.
Exactly. Yeah, it's sort of a meme combined with a technique of entity governance.
So, are you a big Star Trek fan?
I'm not I'm more of a Star Wars fan than I'm a Star Trek fan, but I grew up. I was a kid when Star Trek: The Next Generation was in its heyday, so obviously I know the Borg, and I've seen like every Star Trek movie. So I wouldn't call myself a Trekkie, but it just kind of worked as a metaphor, and so we ran with it. Yeah,
Got it. I mean, it's great for memes, right? Like you could see like all the Borg memes popping out of
that's
it.
right.
I had a lot of fun trying to do the art for this, and trying to get you into like a Borg
The
suit.
art is sick.
I
Love
tried.
it.
Mid Journey like has like certain limitations in terms of like what it can do. Like it didn't really seem to get what a Borg was. Um, so it took longer than I would care to admit to actually get the artwork together, but I got something, and I was trying to like get
Yeah,
some
I
sci.
found the same because yeah, we did Mid Journey for like the article image as well, and yeah, it was a similar thing. I had to say like cybernetic, person who has a cube and stuff like that instead of saying Borg. Yeah,
And then in particular, like I was trying to like you posted a picture of like a pillow with a anime girl on it. I was trying to get a Borg version of her in there, but that was too much for Midjourney.
nice.
Um, all right. So as someone who's like had some experience with what I thought was a DAO, maybe what I was have been trying to build out, it wasn't technically a DAO under this definition, but like we were going to like aspire to be more like it. And we had a lot of conversations about some of the same stuff about like how do we get these appendages in meat space. Um, like let's so like I like DAOs and I think that they're like the future of organizing all these things, but also like there's a lot of frustrations that come with doing a DAO on chain. And in particular, like I think that when you have a DAO at like the super earliest stages, it's the most difficult. Um, like for example, if you are trying to like build a startup, you don't need to conduct a snapshot vote and wait 24 hours before you take literally any action. You just get as much done in a day as you can, right? Um, so
Right.
like I feel like, and this also like relates to this like debate about like centralization within DeFi. Like you see all these DeFi services that essentially start super centralized because there's not really a practical way of getting things done. Like you can't just issue a token to a million people and get them all to vote on getting your like service off the ground. So I kind of like am forgiving
Right.
of these like projects that have to be centralized at first, but do actually take meaningful steps towards decentralizing. And my thought is it might be kind of similar with this like DAO Borg type thing. Like if you're starting to get a DAO off the ground, you might just start it in like the like jankiest ways of like, okay, we'll just do some Discord thumbs up, thumbs down votes. And then once you get to a stage and like you actually start to see stuff working, then you take the steps to like formalize all this, like create a full DAO, create the appendage Borgs. At least that would be my
Right.
thought. But like you're the lawyer, would you push back on that and say that like if you're starting a DAO, you should like absolutely start as like a DAO with a bunch of Borg set up properly from day one? Like, what's your thought to people who want to get started in
Uh,
the DAO space?
I I mean, it kind of depends. It kind of depends what you're doing, right? Some things. If you start out if you start out with a lot of trust, right? If you're in like governance can be worse than like no governance, legally speaking, right? Like if you're like letting people govern, like let's just say you're developing a product, right? And let's just say you're calling whatever your product is like a DAO or governed by a DAO, and you're calling your users like the governors of that, right? By going to your users in this kind of trustful manner and saying, hey, vote on what you want us to do, and we're always going to do that. You govern us, right? You're creating duties for yourself, right? You're arguably like becoming a fiduciary because their votes aren't like self-executing, right? Because they're not on chain. They're trusting you to do what they say, right? So you're essentially their agent and you're possibly their fiduciary. So in the early stages, I actually think like until you can do the governance in an on-chain way, it's better like not to call it a DAO yet. You can still get feedback. You could do polls, but you could just call it like a non-binding poll or like call it a survey, right? And ultimately to say, oh, we're soliciting feedback, right? And not imply this agency relationship, because once you have that agency relationship, it's very hard to unwind that. And once you start the DAO, it may still kind of be contaminated by that. And if you look at the UkiDAO case, both or it used to be called BZX, both in the CFTC's lawsuit and this class action lawsuit related to a hack that they have, they really use that. They use the fact that it was initially centralized around this company and it was initially like completely trustful, and the devs were kind of like portraying that they could be trusted to act on behalf of users in certain ways, and they're using that even to extend liability to later on when the DAO was properly set up. So I do think that there's like this need to like bootstrap decentralization, but people should be working with a lawyer from the start to kind of phrase that in the most legally optimal way, and not create this like fiduciary type of relationship, because it can really poison things even into the future when you do decentralize them.
Yeah, so it makes sense to me. It makes sense to me. One other question that I wanted to bring up was around the like, so you basically say within the thing that the like origin story of DAOs is that DAOs should be paying things in their like native token, right? Now I think it makes perfect sense, and I think like the capability of spinning up tokens so quickly is one of the cool things about DeFi. But I think lately there's been a lot of like people concerned about spinning up tokens because, like, as our current SEC chair says, basically every token is a security by virtue of being a token. I might be mischaracterizing his
Right.
exact position. But like, if a DAO is trying to be like truly like core to like how DAOs are supposed to function, does that expose them to like securities laws risk by paying by issuing and paying for things with their native token?
Sure. I guess I would ask what's the alternative, but because all the alternatives might be equally or more risky. But yeah, I mean, every new token at this point, is at high risk of being deemed a security in the United States. So this is a major issue. Um, but if you're I think it's kind of the same thing if you were paying in some other token, because all those tokens are probably securities as well under US law, and you're probably not complying with the securities laws when you pay people with them. So yeah, I think it's the same issue either way, if that makes sense.
Got it.
But
Yeah.
yeah, certainly is a big issue. Yeah.
But I think that might get to like some additional pushback people might have, which is like, what's the point of trying to structure things legally if it's going to be inherently like under the suspicion of illegality in terms of everything, literally everything it's doing? Like, is there any
Right.
way that you like?
Well, so yeah, I mean, there's a few things there. I mean, number one, there's going to be a lot of litigation over the securities law status of tokens. I mean, just because the SEC is saying that they're all securities doesn't mean that it's true. And in particular, I think one avenue that hasn't really been sort of adequately litigated yet, particularly with like ultra modern DAOs like Curve, that really like that really create like an internal market, and are very autonomous and very on chain, and are governing these protocols and have like a flywheel going, is that there's a presumption under U.S. securities laws that interest in a partnership are not securities, right? Because the idea is everyone is putting in their own efforts, right? And they all have full, complete information. They're not really relying on others to do things. And this is a defense that hasn't really been litigated yet, because almost all the tokens that the SEC has pursued have been like 2017 style ICO tokens that ironically had no intrinsic economics to them and had no voting powers to them, but were sort of like tied to the a more kind of proprietary commercial product, such as like a YouTube type of clone in the case of Library, or like this kind of like payment banking fintech thing in Ripple, or like a messenger app in the case of like Telegram and Kick, all of which are like very Web 2 things, right? Whereas like something like MakerDAO, or like Curve, or some of these true DAOs, they could arguably be partnerships, right? Because everyone is supposed to be participating in the decision making, and all that. So that's one defense that's kind of out there, for true DAOs, that has never really been fully followed, just for whatever it's worth. The other piece of it is that uh, the U.S. is just one country. It is like the most powerful country and the most influential, but it's just one country, and other jurisdictions don't really seem to be following the U.S.'s lead on crypto. We've just had a comprehensive kind of crypto regulatory package passed in the EU, or at least by the EU Parliament for adoption by the EU member states, called MiCA, and that doesn't treat tokens as the European equivalent of securities. It treats them as something different, and it doesn't require this permissioned registration process, even in order to be able to sell a token. You could even sell a token, and all you have to do is like file a disclosure statement that follows certain rules, and it would be legal. So, I still think there's a future here, because projects can, try to block the U.S. in certain ways, and there's still going to be countries that have where they can comply and still form these DAOs and things like that. So I'm pretty bullish on that overall. We have to see how these other laws evolve, but the U.S. unfortunately is just taking a different strategy, and the rest of the world is not following that.
Yeah, and I actually share like a lot of your optimism, and we can talk a bit more depth about Mika in just a little bit. But before, I want to just like it just, as an outside observer, it's frustrating because I see like all the like work that you and all these other great crypto lawyers are doing in terms of like trying to advance these legal theories, And from my point of view, like the actions of regulators, almost like you've heard the phrase like "don't quote laws to men with swords." Like they seem to not even care about any legal
Right.
arguments. They're just like throwing the regulatory book at everybody who's anywhere close to crypto, and they're just counting on the courts will sort it out later, but creating such a firestorm. It seems more like stochastic terrorism to me than any other coherent like regulatory philosophy. Is that a fair like assessment?
Yeah, I think that's right. They could they could be doing things within their current authority to try to accommodate crypto, but I think they've just decided it's sort of toxic or it's too soon, or something like that, and they're sort of essentially they're pursuing a, a prohibition type of approach without wanting to say that, right? Instead, they just say, "Oh, there are these existing laws, and these systems can't comply with them," and they're not even saying they can't comply with them. They're saying there are these existing laws, you should comply with them, and it's kind of intellectually disingenuous because complying with them would just mean designing the software in a different way. So it's a backdoor prohibition on the current designs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, it's just unfortunate in that way, but that's the approach they're taking, sadly.
So, so then isn't the antidote to that not to like develop like new innovative legal frameworks like Dowels and Borgs, but to just become like full on OX Bunny uses the phrase like Vietnamese guerrilla farmers, like all out guerrilla warfare. Like go completely underground, go completely on chain, and just try and not touch the U.S. regulatory system as possible. Wouldn't that be the like logical way to fight back?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, of course, it's hard with permissionless systems to completely wall off the U.S., right? You would have to like to completely do that. You would have to add KYC and stuff to the protocol, and then you've kind of like lost in a different way. But I think that I don't know that U.S. Jurisdiction is so strict as to require that, and I think there are things you can do, like if like for the relevant website, which is kind of like a centralized service, at least wall that off from the U.S., and things of this sort, and try to operate in the jurisdictions, that are more welcoming of this.
Yeah, I mean, and also like even if you try and do all that, like, and you see that the U.S. like likes to claim jurisdiction in some ways. Like they'll say like, oh, most Ethereum nodes are in America, so therefore, if you're on Ethereum, you're American, right? But
Right? Yeah.
that does become a question more of diplomacy, I think, than anything else, right? Like it's only if the countries accept those jurisdictions. So there's stuff that could be done there. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so like what's your opinion of like because you definitely say like DAO should be completely off on chain and Borgs can be the bridges. Though there's a pretty strong like case some people make in terms of saying that like real world assets aren't really going to work on chain because like you need to have this complete segregation of on chain and off chain at least for the time being until the regulatory structure gets there. Do you think that that's like it becomes like an implicit criticism of this concept of Borgs, which would be this kind of hybrid?
Well, I think so. Real world assets is a very challenging problem, and the reason why is that, um, well, first of all, like we have to like real world assets is like a horrible like misnomer for what it is, right? In the vast majority of cases, they're actually asset backed securities, right? Is what they are, right? Like you get an entity owns something, and then the entity issues shares, right? And those shares can be used as like collateral in a protocol or some type of like lending relationship, and can be foreclosed upon, right? If there's a if the debt is outstanding, or like the health factor is too low, right? Um, so really, it's asset-backed securities that we're talking about, and trying to tokenize those, right? That would be what is a real-world asset in most cases, and not all, but most. And the problem with this is that we have in like modern day finance a very well established antipathy toward what are called bearer securities, which is like securities where just whoever happens to hold them at a given time like is the legitimate owner of them. You like a lot of spy movies have like bearer bonds, right? For this reason, like it used to be a good tool for money laundering, and that's why they're not really like completely allowed anymore. And so to have true like on chain like securities, they would need to the tokens would basically need to be like the functional equivalent of like a bearer share, right? Because like you need any liquidator to be able to come in and like liquidate that CDP in the case of MakerDAO and become like the legal owner of that share without someone being able to like rug them, right? So you can do like gated versions of this, but it's just not as good and like defeats a lot of the purpose of the blockchain stuff. So yes, like this is a legit challenge. Nonetheless, I actually think like Borgs are very well suited to this, right? Because right now, like MakerDAO has it's lending against real world assets by having these like trust entities that like hold the assets, like they might hold U.S. Treasuries, for example. And then there's like some type of commitment on the part of that entity to basically like like honor the fact that like those treasuries have sort of been committed to the MakerDAO protocol, right? And to like go and like liquidate them and like buy back like on like crypto proceeds with them if that's needed, and then like give them back to MakerDAO and like that sort of stuff, right? Um, so this is perfect for Borgs, right? Because instead of being just like a normal trust entity that literally it's called a trust for a reason, it's because you're trusting the trustees to do the right thing. You could instead add certain like programmatic on-chain controls to that give like the MKR holders more and more of an influence, right? And I think MakerDAO will move in this direction as well. And so like it's the perfect use case, to be honest. Like you could have RWA Borgs, real world asset Borgs, and it would be like yeah, like you could say that basically the treasuries are tokenized and they have to live in a certain multi-sig, and you could have like MakerDAO itself be a member of that multi-sig, and like you could have a rule, for example, that like in a liquidation scenario, like all the other trustees, all the human trustees have to resign, and then like that just leaves like MakerDAO itself in control of these like tokens, right? Things like that. It's obviously like a lot of things to work through with that, and I'm just sort of brainstorming on the fly. But I think this is a good use case for Borgs, actually.
Yeah, what do you think of the whole MakerDAO end game? Do you think it's going to succeed? Do you think they're just going to become a like end up just going almost completely off chain? Do you think they'll get back to the kind of like fulfill the complete like vision of it? What's your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, I was like bold experiments, and I think it's a very bold experiment, right? I think one of the aspects of the end game is that they've adopted this like constitution for the DAO, right? And this constitution sets forth these like strategic priorities. Like we want to eventually have complete decentralization, but to get complete decentralization, we're willing to like temporarily have more centralization, and we want to have these environmental goals in everything we do, and so on and so forth. To me, this is the legal nightmare. This is exactly the sort of thing I'm trying to avoid, because no one knows what the legal import of this constitution is, right? Okay, so now you've passed this. What is it? Okay, if like there's now like MKR gets into the hands of people who like disagree with this, and they start passing non ESG things, what does that mean exactly, right? Does that mean they like violated the Constitution? And like, can someone sue some people over that? Like, I just don't really get this, right? Like when you pass social slash legal rules that are like written in natural language in like a text, and have like like strategies and priorities and values and stuff. To me, unless you like put that into an entity, like no one knows what it means, and it's like a legal minefield. I know very well what it means when it's in an entity. It means that if the managers of the entities don't follow that document, they can be sued for violating those principles, right? But I don't know what it means when this like DAO does it, because I don't even know what the DAO is. I don't know if the DAO is an entity. I don't know who are the members of that entity at a given time. Is it every MKR holder? Is it just the ones who are actively voting? It just gets very bad. So like that's where I worry about the end game, to be honest. It's like this desire to like have freedom, but also to like coerce it into like these like this like strategy, this long-term strategy. I just don't think it works. If you want a long-term strategy, like set up an entity, right? It doesn't work for these like on-chain things. They're meant to be anarchic, right? So yeah, I do worry about that aspect of it.
So obviously, Curve is near and dear to my heart. What is your kind of assessment of Curve? You talk about it briefly in your Borg thing in terms of the Curve Emergency DAO, which would probably be better rebranded
Right.
under this parlance as a Curve Emergency Borg. But where else?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But where else throughout the Curve
Yeah. I mean,
ecosystem is it
I
like?
think Curve is like probably yeah, I think Curve is probably like the best DAO that exists. Because the first of all, like the protocol doesn't really need much governance, right? Like essentially it works as an immutable protocol. It's an AMM, right? And the only thing that is really needed in terms of governance for the protocol is deciding like which pools should get more curve as an incentive, right? Or as an incentive, or as like another way you could look at it is like the these are the pools where that are the most important, and therefore liquidity providers in that pool should get the most like extra voice in curve governance going forward, right? Different ways you could look at it, but the that's really kind of the only governance decision that's needed. And what Curve has brilliantly done is it has created a market for that governance decision, right? Where people can like sell votes to each other. So the whoever cares the most about deciding which pools should get the curve can buy that power to decide that, right? And so this is brilliant because you don't need politics anymore. You just need a market, right? You just need people buying and selling. And I think it just works beautifully, basically. And more DAOs need to do this. They need to figure out a way to like avoid all the politics, avoid all the discussions, and instead just create a market. And if you can't do that, then probably you should be having like these Borg entities, right? So the emergency multisig, I would consider that it has very limited powers, which is great. All it can do, and by the way, I'm on it. I'm a signer on that multisig, but
You're 7 of 9.
it is it is unincorporated. But like I think it probably would be better off if it were incorporated and like had these rules enshrined, in a document somewhere. But that being said, it's not the biggest deal that it's not incorporated because it only has very limited powers. What can it do? I think it can like turn off a new pool within the first 60 days, if I recall correctly, right?
And it can
So,
freeze
but
emissions.
all that turning it off means, yeah, all that turning it off means is just that it switches it into like withdrawal only mode, right?
Right.
So we can't rug anyone. No one's really trusting us to decide to like take their money. Potentially, we can't take their money. And then the other one, as you said, is it could just like turn off curve emissions to a pool, right? Which is not essential for its functioning. So this is very limited, but yeah, ultimately I'd say like this is a Borg, and it would be best off if it were in an entity, and it just kind of like the rules clearly explain that these are the powers, and what they will be used for, etc. But yeah, I think it's a great DAO. It's one of like the preeminent DAOs that are like the most cross produced, and like it truly is like a robot, right?
And then yeah, Mitch himself has like his company in Switzerland, Swiss Stake, which owns the intellectual property. So I guess that would also be a Borg under this.
Yeah, it could be. It would be good to make that a Borg, just to sort of say, make clear to everyone how those intellectual property rights would be used, right? Which is probably not clear to people currently, and it's just kind of like they could probably use them in almost any way that they want, right? They have good incentives because probably they're all like a bunch of token holders as well, I assume. So like they're like relatively aligned with all the more automated parts of it. But yeah, like personally, I would say in the ideal case that would be part of a Borg as well.
Yeah, so he's a little busy right now, as you might imagine. But have you like considered reaching out to him to like actually formalize it? It could be good publicity for your Borg concept if Curve Swiss Stake
Yeah, I should do
rebranded.
that, particularly for the Yeah, particularly for the emergency multisig, like I think it's pretty prime. So, I'm working on some of like the first boards now for Delphi Labs for some of the protocols that we work on, and I think once I'm like very happy with the like the documentation for that, and one of them will be a security multisig type of thing. I'm going to shop it around to more protocols and try to get them to adopt it and so on.
Yeah, that's cool. Let me know. I mean, you know everyone better than I do, so I don't think you need any help from me. But if you do, feel free to ping me.
Will do.
Any other like ambient thoughts or like ideas about this Borg that you feel like you haven't gotten a chance to talk about, or can we after 45 minutes move off the topic of Borg?
I think we can move off. Yeah, I think we've hit it pretty well.
It's so cool though. I mean, like you put a ton of thought and like research into it, so really appreciate what you do in terms of that. Let's go ahead and circle back to the EU bill because I'm not super familiar on it. I'm sure you're not a EU lawyer, so you're just speaking as a private citizen and like armchair observer. It sounds like it's kind of getting this mixed reaction, right? Like people are happy that it's actually like enshrining things, but then there's like some specific portions of it that is going to basically make it like horrible for people in the EU, right? Like the capability of transferring like less than $1,000 or something to self-hosted wallets.
That's actually a different thing. That's under their like AML regs.
Oh, I see.
So it's a little bit different from Mika. And I don't think that is actually final yet. So I'm hoping that still comes out in a good way. But really, what that would be, again, I'm a DeFi guy. I think you're probably a DeFi guy. I don't think that really is going to affect true DeFi. Because I think that's more aimed at people who are providing a service, right? Like a centralized exchange, that sort of thing, to try to get them to, make sure that as many, cold wallets as possible are kind of like tied to a particular person's identity. So I'm hoping that shakes out the right way. I'm not the best expert on it, but generally speaking, I don't think that is like squarely aimed at DeFi. I think it's more of a centralized exchange thing. As for Mika, it does create this new sort of category of service provider called a crypto asset service provider. And it basically provides that if you are a CASP in the EU, that you would need to get a license, right? And then once you have that license, you could do all sorts of things, right? So like a centralized exchange would get this. But I also think that, for example, DeFi protocols that are in their very early stages, where like let's just say there's a multi-sig that has like God mode upgrade authority, right? Like it can completely upgrade the contract, it can stop the contract, this kind of quasi custodial power through upgrades. The team that has that authority, yeah, they might be a CASP in the EU, and they might have to get licensed, or they might have to borrow the license of someone who's been set up to do that sort of thing, right? Um, but I kind of think that's like, as if you have that kind of custodial power, whether it's through code or through like full what we more normally think of as custody, which is like you're just literally sending it to an externally owned account, that's controlled by the exchange, whatever it is. I mean, if you have that amount of power, yeah, you are an intermediary and you probably could be licensed in some way. The question is just like, is the license gettable? Is it cost effective, right? Are the regulations that the licensee to follow, reasonable? And so far, to me, it looks pretty reasonable. We have to see like exactly how what the framework is implemented by the member states, but I don't see any real blockers here. And the thing that I really like about it is that it finally has this framework where you can clearly do a token sale. Like you can actually do we could go back to ICOs, which I think were much better than all the kind of like weird VC stuff we have now, where like the VCs get this huge amount and then like the rest is distributed through liquidity mining, and it's just kind of a mess. We could go back to ICOs, and you don't even have to get a regulator's permission to do the ICO. You just have to follow a rule that there's like this 18-day refund period, and you have to like publish this, what's called a white paper, although it's not what we normally think of as a white paper. It's more of a legal document. But if you follow those steps, you can actually raise capital by selling tokens again. And for me, that would, if it works out like that, I mean, that would be hugely beneficial for decentralization, for capital raising, for all these things, and it would clarify a lot and be very good.
Yeah, and then theoretically, if it starts off, then they can start like amending it right based on reality. The thing I keep thinking about when I see this
Exactly.
is like the New York bit license, which I'm old enough to remember when it was like put into effect. And back then it was it was New York's killing themselves. This is like bad for crypto. This is the death of it. But it almost seems like it's coming full circle. Did you watch the stablecoin hearing this past week in Congress?
I actually missed that, sadly. Yeah, so I've heard a few things about it, but yeah, I didn't watch it.
It was actually really good. I'd recommend like listening to it. So one of the interesting parts that came out of it was Representative Torres from New York, who was probably like one of the better uh, probably like pound for pound better than even Emmer in terms of like his position, being for my estimation in terms of like because he's pro crypto, but he's also like on the Democratic side, and you don't have enough like really like. But on top of that, he's like really good, right? So he was one of the panelists, and I might be mixing up the hearings in particular, but one of the panelists was one of the regulators within New York, and he basically used her through his line of questioning to basically say like isn't it the case that like New York already has like really effective regulations on the book, and if the federal government tried to come in and like supersede it, it might be like a bad thing, and basically saying like that's like a hard line. And then also like what I thought was really good was he was asking her like straight up like in New York like so he basically said like okay Gensler like has argued that like if there's cryptocurrencies are not counted as securities it's going to be the end of the world. In New York though you have a dual framework, right? So you have securities and you have a crypto department and they're separate and it hasn't been the end of the world. It's been quite effective, right? So essentially like using this kind of bit license to like argue in favor of a cryptocurrency regulatory regime from the language of the left, which to me seems like that's like a winning pitch or something. I don't know. Ignore my
Yeah, I
ramblings
mean,
there.
yeah, no, it just makes sense. I mean, it's just, the technology is very unique. It has unique mechanisms. All of our existing financial regulations are really built on this idea of regulating intermediaries, and the whole point of the technology is not to have intermediaries. So, it just makes sense that there would be something new for it. And, ultimately, uh, yeah, I mean, I think what you're seeing like in Europe and some other places is they just looked at this very rationally, and they just said, yeah, like look, this like overlap with some like policy concerns of the securities laws and other things, but ultimately it's quite unique. Let's just pass some laws to like specifically cover this, right? And we can do specific licenses, and we can tweak it over time and things like that, and it's just going to work much better, than the current U.S. federal government approach of fitting square pegs into round holes. And I think they're going to see that, and there's going to be a lot of pressure, under the U.S. government and under Congress once like the EU starts going and they see that it's successful to do it this way. Like I think the U.S. will ultimately end up doing it that way as well.
Yeah. So is there like a potential like way out of this kind of internal debate between the CFTC and the SEC about is it a security or is it a commodity? If Congress just like passed a simple bill saying there's going to be a like brand new asset class called a crypto asset that's governed by neither the CFTC nor the SEC, but this new organization that's getting created, is that the best outcome to all this in your opinion, or is there like a better solution?
I think that would be the best outcome, but I also unfortunately think it's like a very implausible outcome, because
That's
like no one likes to create new regulatory agencies, and it's quite difficult. So, but I do think that we need like Congress to act, and they'll have to carve up SEC and CFTC jurisdiction in some way, which could be to just like give jurisdiction to one of them, right? Like there are definitely ways to do it. You could honestly give it to either one of them. That's definitely possible. But I hope that it's given to them in a way where like they don't just have like carte blanche to do whatever with it, but rather like Congress actually like thinks about what rules make sense and like tries to like really give like some like constraints to the regulator about how they're going to deal with this asset class.
yeah. Shoot, I was let's hope something good comes out of it. But yeah, I'm not necessarily
We
optimistic. Is
do
it?
have
Go ahead.
right. We do have. I mean, just to point out, like we do have things that are like co-regulated by the SEC and CFTC currently, right? Like we have swaps,
Mm-hmm.
which is like the whole like 2008 crisis was based on credit default swaps, and then we passed laws that like formalize regulation of swaps, and some of them are security swaps and some of them are commodity swaps. And the SEC and the CFTC kind of like are required to like work together to like carve up this like swaps market between them. So it's definitely possible. It's just complicated, and like Congress has to make sure that it works and pass new laws, right?
Yeah. So speaking of, so I mean, like first before Congress gets to like a general crypto framework, it's probably going to need to come to resolution on this stablecoin bill, which seems like it's closer to passing. Um, Now, I've read the new payment stablecoin bill also in its entirety, which is longer than your Borg, but they use these huge
Nice.
margins, like college students trying to write a report and like meet the page quota. So it's actually pretty quick to read. I found, and it was not bad. Most of it, like 80%, was that your takeaway from the payment stablecoins? Like it's pretty decent shot at trying to like establish the stablecoin framework in the U.S. Or have you not read it?
Yeah, sorry, you actually yeah, you broke up a little bit there. I've read some previous like versions of it. I haven't read this like new latest one. Yeah, so yeah, I can't really comment on it in depth, unfortunately.
But from the
It's
previous
more of a
versions,
because
from the
yeah,
previous versions you read, they're like,
yeah,
would you
yeah, yeah.
think they're
Go
like
ahead.
like characterize it as like a productive attempt, or is it like just kind of irrelevant?
Yeah, it's definitely yeah, it's definitely productive. Like I think like it allows private companies to issue stable coins, which I definitely think is important, right? Like I think probably just having banks do this would be terrible. So broadly speaking, I think that's the right approach. I know there's this like kind of interesting thing in there of like trying to ban algorithmic stables, but then like they define algo stable like very very narrowly. Like it like basically if you have like almost any real like non-correlated collateral in there, then it's like not an algo stable anymore. And honestly, I kind of having been like sort of like lost a lot of money on Terra, like I think that's not necessarily a bad idea, and like maybe it should even be honestly like broader because I kind of think of like algos as like the nuclear weapons of like crypto now, where it's just like it's almost like it's so like the juice is not worth the squeeze, right? It's almost like I just think we shouldn't even be attempting these experiments now because like the negative effects from them going badly almost like outweigh any good that could possibly be delivered by them, because ultimately like what you if it's successful, then like okay, you've got something that is like a decentralized version of fiat, which is completely centralized government based anyway. Like it's just the risk is not worth the reward. So I even kind of agree with that part of it about banning algo stables at this point, I would say.
Yeah, and I actually even from within the DeFi community haven't heard too much pushback on that point. So like I think generally
Yep.
speaking, like again, like 80% of the bill is like if you are going to be following this kind of U.S. framework for payment stablecoins, you have to have like this backing of assets, and like you can't do anything crazy with the money, and like I don't think anyone would find most of that controversial, except if you're like maybe if you're Circle or like you know Coinbase, like maybe you like really have strong opinions on what you can do with it, but it's not going to affect most of us. It's just going to make the payment stablecoins like
Yeah,
really
that's
good.
right. Yeah, the thing that would kill, and I don't think it's in the bill, the thing that would kill, stables is if like KYC was required at every hop, right? Because then you really couldn't use them as like collateral and MakerDAO, for example, and things like that. So I don't think it requires that. It seems like so that's good. And then honestly, in terms of like the custody requirements, I mean, yeah, it should be regulated. It's like 100% trustful, right?
Yeah,
Like, yeah, I
exactly.
want I want a regulator to make sure all the backing is there. So overall, like, it seems to be going in a positive direction.
Yeah. So the only quibble I had with the latest draft, and I'm not a lawyer, so I might be misinterpreting this, but I have this section up on screen here that has me like kind of concerned, which is just how they define a payment stablecoin, right? Because the bill only applies to payment stablecoins as opposed to like algorithmic stablecoins, which they have issue and like on chain things like backed by Ether or whatever. Um, like it seems pretty clear the bill's trying to target like those like deposit based like one to one backed. But then this section here where they define a payment stablecoin seems like it's casting such a broad net that it would literally encompass anything that was worth a dollar. The specific phrase is 16A2 here, where it represents, will maintain, or creates the reasonable expectation that will maintain a stable value relative to the value of a fixed amount of monetary value. So to me, that means that like this would encompass, for example, curv.USD or Frax or LUSD or any of the like on-chain stablecoins, and could become ammunition to go after some of the decentralized stablecoins. Am I reading this right, or am I like off my rocker?
I would have to look at that more closely based on the current draft. Yeah, and I just haven't had a chance,
Of
unfortunately.
course, yeah. You had a huge Borg paper
Yeah,
to write. I get it.
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
And you didn't use fat margins. You just used medium. So
that's right. Yeah,
well, just cite me as one concerned pleb as you read through it to run that up the flagpole, because you're in better touch with the legal
yeah,
circles than
that's
I
right.
am.
I know in a previous bill that was like sponsored by McHenry, there was a similar kind of dynamic, but it wasn't really it didn't really seem to be an issue because you could just use like different nomenclature, and it was ultimately based on kind of like what nomenclature you used. And so like if you, instead of calling it like a stable coin, you called it like something else, it would have been solved. I don't know if that's the case in this bill or not. Yeah, I just have to look at it more.
Oh yeah, yeah. It makes. I mean, it looks like it's the kind of thing where like one line gets tweaked or clarified, and it like the bill's great. Or if the one line's bad, then
Yeah,
it might like bring the end of DeFi. So, you got
that's
to
right.
watch out, because like there's obviously like even if this is what ends up passing, it's still better than the Warren bill, which thankfully got is failing to find co-sponsors. It's failing to find their anti-crypto army, right?
Yes, I was very pleased to see that.
So yeah, I mean, what do you know from like the legal circles about like the game going on in Washington D.C. around Warren and her anti-crypto army?
Yeah, I think it's not really getting much traction because it's just too extreme, and ultimately, like, it doesn't really make sense that crypto is this, partisan issue, right?
It doesn't, right? It's so
So I think that's
crazy.
good. I don't. It's puzzling. It's puzzling that she's focused on this, and I'm not sure. I haven't really heard any good theory as to like why he's like demonizing crypto so much. It may be the only like sort of conspiracy theory I've heard is like that it's know certain like banks maybe are funding her and want to tamp down on crypto, but I have no idea if that's true. That's the only plausible explanation I can really like think of, though. Although I guess it's also just possible. I mean, she's actually been a very passionate um you know uh uh scholar and law professor on like different types of economic issues her whole life. Initially, she was actually an extreme right winger in terms of like economic issues, and then eventually she became like an extreme winger on economic issues. So it actually is possible. I think sometimes people go too far with conspiracy theories that she just honestly thinks it's crap. She just thinks it's crap. She thinks it's dangerous, and she just is against it for that reason. I mean, I do think that that's possible, and in a certain sense, it's not the craziest thing in the world because a lot of people are harmed by crypto,
It's true.
in its current form. Like there are a lot of scams, and so I can understand a lot of her concerns. I just think the reaction is way too extreme of seeing like no good in it and not realizing that it's still kind of in an iterative stage and it will get better and better, and seeing that like ultimately the costs, and there are real costs, maybe worth the benefits, because the benefits could be like completely not having to trust anyone ever with your money, right, and being able to like do everything without any interference, and with complete transparency and complete egalitarianism. And she just doesn't seem to see that side of the coin, right, that ultimately could emerge from all this. So if you don't see that, then I could kind of understand hating it, right, and thinking that it's just toxic and dangerous. But that's just ignorance, I think, not understanding the potential of it.
Yeah, my read on it is that she spent so much time trying to get the Consumer Financial Protection Board implemented, which is, it was her pet project, and it took her like like a decade maybe. And when she got that, like that
Right.
gives her a great deal of leverage in theory to act on behalf of like regular consumers. And crypto like disintermediates her a little bit, because if all of a sudden she has no control over crypto, where she has some leverage over banks, like I could just see her like being like, okay, well I can't fulfill my mission now, so let's like try and attack it. um, But
The CFPB though could still, it could become like a good regulator of crypto, at least certain things of it. Like
right, yeah,
it could look at like look at a typical DeFi website and like look at how the APYs are disclosed, right? And is it actually accurate, right? Is it misleading? And like the CFPB could go and say, your APY disclosures are wrong or they're misleading, and we're going to sue you over that because of your website.
exactly.
And to me, that would be like totally fair game. Like, in fact, I would like to see that. Just don't try to ban the whole technology, right? That doesn't make sense. Try to be positive toward it, be constructive, and take regulatory actions that are designed to like produce better plain language disclosure, make sure that people are caring about that, and all these sorts of things. Like then it would be a positive symbiotic relationship. But that unfortunately, that's like not the way they're going.
Yeah, it's like if you rebuilt all the regulations, if now these regulatory bodies existed and you were building something from scratch, what you came up with would not be the system you have today. You would have something that's very focused on like educating people about scams. You might have like smart contract auditors being given away as a service so that people can get their smart contracts audited and approved. And you could just imagine how much good like an entity regulated by you or Hester like would actually be as opposed to what we currently get, which is like almost the complete opposite.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're talking about Warren. I don't think it in 2023. I'm not sure these labels even matter anymore. But do you consider yourself more left wing, more right wing, or like is that just fully irrelevant?
I consider myself like economically right wing and like socially left wing, which basically means I'm like unrepresented in government in the U.S. But and then yeah, that's how they screw us.
I
But
think feeling
yeah,
unrepresented is the biggest voting block because isn't it like 60% of people don't vote? So
that's me. I've actually never voted in any election because I don't feel like I'm represented by any of the candidates. Yeah.
yeah, no, I hear that. I was just kind of curious on your take on it because, like you say, it's in some ways becoming a partisan issue, which is asinine, and it shouldn't be the case. What strikes me as really funny about it is like I'm going on like a personal mission to be like a pro single issue cryptocurrency voter. Um, but
Nice.
what's funny about that though is because like I feel like people are saying like, well, crypto is becoming this right wing issue. But if I actually look at my personal slate of candidates, like that I'm voting for solely on the issue of cryptocurrency, like I'm almost voting straight party Democratic, because my current district has someone who's like not bad on crypto, and the current front runner for president
Nice.
for the, in my estimation, for the single issue crypto voter is Robert Kennedy Jr. He's the only one that I've noticed who's like spoken explicitly about like Bitcoin being a good escape ramp. So it's kind of like I don't necessarily.
Interesting. I didn't know that about him actually, but yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I don't think he can win though. His voice, he's got like that spasmodic dysphonia or whatever, and it
Yeah.
it matters, right? Like people like want their candidate to like look pretty, right, and sound pretty.
And height matters, right? Like, doesn't the shorter candidate like almost like always lose, right? It's just crazy. It's
Exactly.
so
It's like,
crazy. We're still just monkeys ultimately. It's kind of sad,
and
but
yeah, the
yeah.
system, yeah, it makes you really pessimistic about the system. But I am optimistic that we're gonna get things there. Or, do you consider yourself a doomerist?
Uh, no, I think I'm more of a, well,
Because I feel like
I
I detect a
I
little
think I'm more of like an
doomerism in some of your
accelerationist.
posts. Accelerationist.
Yeah, there is that's not really like a philosophy. That's more just like me being in a bad mood a lot of times. But I think I'm more like an accelerationist ultimately. But like I think like accelerationism can like often like bleed into doomerism. It's just like it's the same thing ultimately. It's just like whether you feel excited about it or not. If you think about it, right? Like if you think like, oh, okay, like there are all these like negative trends. Let's like get them over with as soon as possible so something cooler can emerge. That's like one thing. And like you could feel excited about like negative things that are happening, but then on the other hand, like they still are negative things. So if you're like focusing on the fact that they're negative, then it's more like being like doomer about
Okay. Okay, so it's
them
more like eat your
instead.
vegetables, right? Like then you get dessert.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Well, that's good because like
Right. Yeah. Like I just want a futurist ultimately. Like I want to see like like yeah, like I've always wanted a regulatory crackdown actually, because like I want to see if the technology actually can be good or not. And you will never find that out until like people are trying to shut it down. If it can be completely shut down, then it never was what it advertised itself to be in the first place. Because like the whole point of it was supposed to like enable independence from government and stuff like that. So in that sense, like accelerationist, but I'm also like a doomer in the sense that like I think that these are irreconcilable paradigms, right? And so like one side or the other muckle, right? And so like a lot of people will say, oh no, like you can like ultimately it should all be legal and should make this technology compliant. I actually don't think that's the case. I think it's like it is in fact like a something that the point of it is to be able to be independent from governments, and you can never fully reconcile those things. So from that point of view, like you could see like a doomer type of narrative, right?
So do you think that like play things out in the future, like 5, 10 years? Do you think that governments do get flipped and we all like move our like governance on chain, or do you think there's like some weird kind of like Hegelian mixture of government and cryptocurrency that like emerges?
It's both, right? I think there will be like CDFI type of things, where the like people do KYC versions of the technology, like even at the protocol level. But I do think it's just inevitable that the governments can't like play whack-a-mole against this stuff forever, and like they can't control everything. And so eventually, like just like with the war on drugs and all these other things, like eventually the government realizes that it just has to allow certain things, right?
Yeah,
And so like the what Andre Cronje calls like the Badlands, I think will be like ultimately allowed to keep existing, and people will be like, some people will get punished for it in the meantime. Unfortunately, some people will even go to jail for things like mixers and things. But ultimately, it will be allowed because it's just unstoppable, right?
yeah. One thing I was trying to think about the other day, I might try and write this into a full article. But essentially, like Kraken, right? Like they just made a financial decision when the SEC came after them.
Right.
But there actually comes a point where if the number goes up high enough, right? Like if the value of cryptocurrency gets sufficiently high relative to the power of the U.S. government, that there's a number at which like it's unaffordable for the United States to bring lawsuit against literally the entire blanket cryptocurrency space because it's too big and every entity within would decide to fight instead of decide to settle, and they wouldn't actually have the resources to attack everything. I don't
Right.
know what that number is, but I think you could actually like generate a
Right.
model at like at what dollar value does Bitcoin have to hit for it to become resistant against such attacks.
Yeah, and I mean it could even get into like war, right? Because like let's say another nation like owns a lot of Bitcoin, right, and it's powerful, and then like the US is like doing things to like tank the value of Bitcoin, they're not going to like that very much, right? And like so it could even it ultimately I think is going to go there.
It is
And unfortunately, I mean ultimately like this is why this is like so rough for the US, because like the US has the reserve currency, and this stateless money does threaten that reserve currency status. So it's an existential threat in a certain sense.
Oh, and absolutely, the United States is going to do whatever it can to protect it. But I think it's funny because like the logical extension of the network state, hyper nationalization, is that like it's going to create a lot of suffering as nations declare war against each other for their mining resources or for their validator nodes, and you can actually see it happening,
Right.
right?
Totally.
Like, the future
Yep.
generation, not to get doomerist, like enslaved and having like an even more oppressive financial system. Um, it just so happens to be based on
Yep.
cryptocurrency, but they're
Totally.
just like, why do we have to spend all this time and effort and energy to support this beast? Who decided this 100 years ago? But um,
Right. Indeed.
so anyway, I try and purge the doomerism from my system because it's not healthy. Um, all right,
Right.
Coinbase. What do you think's going to happen there? Handicap the Coinbase game.
Well, yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, they're going to have a really hard time. Like the U.S. securities laws are just so broad that the SEC really just always has the odds stacked in its favor, and I'm sure that they're going to be able to convince a judge that like at least one token that traded on Coinbase, was at some point a security or was like an integral part of a securities scheme or was like involved in actions occurring on Coinbase, right? And so like the Coinbase will like from that perspective have like been violating securities law by not being a securities exchange, right? So what the outcome of that is, right? It's very hard to say, because you can't just like extinguish the entire company. So I don't know. It's like it's more about the remedies for me. Like I think Coinbase will like lose the lawsuit in the sense that like some legal violation will probably be found, right? It'd just be very
Mm-hmm.
hard for that not to be the case. But the more interesting thing is like what okay, so what do you do then, right? Because they like there's currently no framework for like a token securities exchange. It doesn't exist, right? So I just don't know, right? It's very unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. But most likely they will lose, at least to the extent of like that some token on the exchange is like implicated in the securities laws, and like they're not a securities exchange.
Got it. What's the like possibility? Like, I don't even know if this is possible, but Hester takes over hypothetically, let's say 2 to 4 years, 6 years, or whatever, at some point when like her party's in power, and looks at this lawsuit. Does she have the power just to say like, we're just gonna settle? We're not pursuing this any further, or is she like going to be required? Under like the purview of that jurisdiction to like continue the lawsuit in good faith that's been started by her predecessor.
She doesn't have the unilateral power, but the commission, which is five members, right? They can decide to do that, right? They can settle it. So, and certainly if she was the chair, then in that scenario, most likely, the Republicans would be having a majority on the commission,
So possible.
and obviously like a lot of definitely, yeah, it's definitely possible, yeah.
Not necessarily likely though. I tend to think Biden's going to get reelection, so we're in for another 4 years of all this. Um, yeah, we talked about the SEC kind of more broadly, but
Yeah, but you don't it could still be the we don't know if Gensler will continue. We don't know if Gensler will continue during Biden's second term, right? Like he may want to move on to other things, or I don't know. There's a lot of rumors about him being very unpopular, even amongst Democrats, because he's so ambitious, and that tends to anger people. So we just don't know. I mean, even if Biden wins, there could be like a more moderate chair appointed. Of course, the chair doesn't control everything anyway, but it does kind of set a tone, right? And I think there are still some people at the FCC who would like to be more constructive for crypto, and so maybe they would have a better chance to do so, with a different chair.
yeah, what's how do you psychoanalyze Gensler?
I think he is a very, very ambitious guy who wants to. He's opinionated about the way the market should work. He believes that a market structure where there are these big, powerful intermediaries that are very highly regulated is the right way for the market to work. And he wants to impose that vision consistently, including on crypto, and he wants to be the guy who reined crypto in and is sort of like remembered for that forever. And he was chair of the CFTC when it was implementing Dodd-Frank, and so yeah, I just think he's very ambitious and he wants to like set history, and he feels like crypto is a good way to do that.
Kind of a big risk though, because if crypto ends up winning, then like he obviously is not going to be remembered favorably.
Yeah, if the current if what we think of as crypto ends up winning,
True,
I think
true, yeah.
he imagines that there's like a few things that are good about the technology, but it would be like even better if like it was regulated. Like that's when you'll see like the really great version of the technology, and then like people, I think he honestly thinks that like it will be better with these regulations, and he'll be remembered as the guy who like made crypto like awesome, and like you can like Nasdaq can run it, and like you can trade stocks on it and stuff like that. I think he probably really thinks that. Yeah, I just think he's wrong, right? And I think like most of us think he's wrong, and kind of just like is missing the point. But yeah,
I don't know. I mean, I'm old enough to know that like these political debates don't seem to go away. It's just a generation dies off, and it does kind of look favorable to us on that front. So every time like there's hearings at the SEC and all these things, they always like refuse to like. Okay, so they refuse to answer whether Ethereum is a security or not, right? And this came out again with someone like the former CFTC chair was being asked about it and would say, I read that as like there's probably some like rule or guideline or something internally that they like have this internal policy where they shouldn't say these things, and that's why like people ask this question knowing that they're not going to violate the policy. But is there like a backstory to that? Like, is there like a reason that people are just like so afraid to answer this basic question?
well, I think it's in the direction of what you're saying. I mean, I think it's that the people are reluctant to ever give up an advantage voluntarily, right? To give
Mm-hmm.
up power voluntarily, right?
Right, right.
And so, you know, if you say something, you're giving something up, and they just want to keep maximum optionality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so they don't want to decide right now, right? They don't have to decide, and so like why should they? And in some sense, like if there's some problem with Ethereum later, like you know the whole network goes down and people are gravely injured, then like they probably would feel pretty stupid if they'd been like, oh, ETH is not a security, and then like they weren't able to like sue anyone over that, and like all the politicians would be like mad at them and stuff, right?
Got it. So just
So I
basic
mean, I'm
game
speaking
theory.
about it in somewhat like childish terms. I also the other element is like no individual person can actually speak for the SEC in a binding way, right? Like Gensler could give his personal opinion about whether ETH is a security or not. And like personally, I think he should be more forthcoming about that personal opinion, but it would just be his personal opinion,
Mm-hmm.
right? Unless the commission, the five commissioners vote on a position, right? And trying that, then it's not the position of the SEC, right?
Right, right. Got it. Interesting. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, game theory. All right. What about some quick hits on like some other things? What's your take on SBF and the whole situation there?
Well, SBF, I mean, we kind of dodged a bullet there, you know, as much damage as it did, right? And I was actually
Seriously.
supposed to debate him on Laura Shin's, I was supposed
Oh
to
my
debate
gosh.
him on Laura Shin's podcast that week.
Oh
I was
no.
scheduled to debate him like literally like 2 days later
That looked
over
amazing.
the bill he was pushing, which was the DCCPA, right? And the thing with the DCCPA, you know, is like clearly he thought he would had like made friends with the CFCC commissioners. Like there are these friendly pictures of him with like arms around, you know, some of the commissioners and stuff. And he thought he would have this like great structural advantage if like the CFTC could just get like carte blanche comprehensive jurisdiction over crypto, and he you know spent millions and millions of dollars to like you know like get curry favor with politicians that they would like pass this, right? And so it really just shows like how dangerous it is to you know like how dangerous this lobbying is and this political influence. And you know a lot of people were trying to play ball with him, right? And like say, okay, let's you know, we don't want to be out of the conversation, so we need to work with this bill and like not say that we like absolutely hate it. But I was someone who I just always said I absolutely hate this bill and I think it's stupid. And Eric Voorhees was also in that category and absolutely shredded, you know, SBF a week prior to the collapse. And so yeah, I just think like we really need to be wary of sort of like corruption from within, and people like using regulation as a weapon to get advantages over others. And we shouldn't just like hand over carte blanche regulatory authority to some agency of like unelected bureaucrats. We should really just like stick to software freedom principles and like demand that very high standard that like software is free, right? A website isn't a broker dealer. It's a website. It's a tool. You know what I mean? So like we just have to like stick to that. And everyone was getting way off base with that. Even like the some more cypherpunk oriented people, because like they want to stay in the conversation, and they're worried that if they just say no to something, then they'll just be like looped out of the conversation. They'll lose all influence whatsoever. But sometimes being excluded from the conversation is the right answer, right? And I think like yeah, like that was the lesson I learned from that. Like, and I hope some other like organizations and stuff learned from that, that like they just should have been just absolutely saying no to this rather than trying to play ball with SBF, right?
Yeah, but now nobody's listening to you. Just kidding. You have like a.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
What
Well,
about?
we have lost. I mean, no, but it's true in the sense that like because we had the worst possible person being the most politically influential, now the politicians just don't want to listen to us at all, right? It's unfortunate.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he really set us back a huge ways. Like, do you think that he's going to be going to prison for a long time? And if so, or do you support that?
Yes. I 100% support that. Yeah, I mean, look, he ruined people's lives, right?
Mm.
And he what he did is just there's nothing unique to crypto about it. I mean, it's just outright fraud, misappropriation,
Oh yeah.
right? All these things. It's just like it's a tale as old as time, and people should go to jail for that. Yeah, absolutely.
Do Kwon?
So Doe's a little different because I mean it's similar in scale. He you know his project really caused people a lot of harm, including me. You know I was like pretty much like financially wiped out from it.
Oh shoot, sorry to
But
hear
it is
that.
a little different in the sense that like you know he did actually have this like Terra was quite a decentralized thing, and it was a software system, and it did what it purported to do, right? Like it, you know, it had this mechanism for converting, you know, something like what we call a seniorage token, or could also be thought of as a governance token, into a stable coin, you know, at a certain ratio that's like designed to maintain this peg. Like it did all that, and it was decentralized. Where you know, I think that the most serious accusations against him are really around, you know, did he lie about this merchant network in Korea called Chai, and what was the like were they faking the transactions on chain to make it seem like people were like all these businesses were really using UST and they weren't. That's probably the most serious accusation against him. And again, you know, if those accusations are true, then that was just ordinary fraud, right? Designed to make it more exciting. But you know, as for creating the mechanism itself and the chain, you know, I don't really think that should be deemed a crime, right?
Mm.
If he said false things about it, then yeah, that could be a crime if people were, you know, relying on that.
Yeah, but you know, like in Silicon Valley, like it's common to like fake it till you make it a little bit. Like, so I get where he's coming from on
That's
that,
right.
and it kind of hurts me a
Right.
little.
It's the Theranos type of thing all over again, right? It's like where do you draw the line between puffery, which is legal, puffery, you know, we recognize under the law that puffery is allowed, and fraud, right? And it is a very fine line. It's a very blurry line. The other thing with that is the the you know, was he using the whole situation to personally enrich himself, right? That's part of the
Yeah,
accusations
that's a whole
in
different
these
thing.
lawsuits, right? And if that's the case, then you know again that could potentially mean it is some sort of Ponzi fraud, particularly you know if it's combined with misleading statements. And these are just facts that I don't know. Unlike with SBF, where I think we all have the facts. It's quite obvious what happened there. I think that with Do Kwon, I'm kind of like in a position of I just don't know. There are these accusations being made, but I haven't seen a lot of facts around them, but there could be very bad facts out there.
Right, right.
And so we'll find out at a trial whether he really did something wrong or not. Right now, I think it's possible, but I haven't like personally decided yet myself.
And then the whole passports faking stuff and whatnot. I gotta say is that non-lawyer having to spend time, extended amount of time around lawyers
Right.
is almost worse than the prison sentence itself, probably. Oh, you're walking away.
So sorry, yeah, my dogs are getting antsy.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, yeah, I mean that's the thing, right? Sometimes the cover up sometimes the cover up, I mean, I tell this to clients all the time. A lot of times, like, you haven't done anything wrong, so don't cover it up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like something like faking a passport itself is a crime, right? So now, like, they could get him just on that alone, right? Just the fact that he was traveling under a fake passport.
Right. Yeah.
And if it'd be unfortunate if, like, he's exonerated on everything else, and then he ends up going to prison just for, like, having a fake passport, right?
Yeah. Got it. Got it. I want to be respectful of your dogs because I'm a big dog person. So just super quick hit. Tornado Cash. Like my understanding is that OFAC revised their previous sanctions. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're talking about the tornado cash situation. Yeah, it was really it's more of a clarification, I think. And it honestly it's been a little while since I looked at that, but they were trying to clarify that it's not the code itself that is sanctioned, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a purported organization of people who are using the code to obfuscate transactions.
Yeah.
And so they basically consider, the people who are using Tornado Cash because they're, the way anonymity works is that the more people who are in the set, the more anonymity you get, right? Or the more robust the anonymity. So in a sense, you could see it as sort of an unincorporated association of people who are, who are cooperating with each other to obfuscate transactions. And that seems to be kind of how OFAC sees it, right? Whether that's actually correct or not, is something that Coin Center is challenging in a lawsuit, right? And so we'll see how that goes. But you can publish the Tornado Cash. What I think that the revision clarified is, like, the fact that you publish the code doesn't doesn't mean you're violating sanctions, right?
So it's a minor
It's this
win.
specific yeah, it's the specific deployment of the code and the fact that people are, in a sense, collaborating around that specific deployment. That is what triggers the sanctions, right?
Okay.
It's a very subtle distinction, but a meaningful
Yeah.
one.
Avi Eisenberg, prison.
That one, I'm not so sure. It's a market manipulation claim. He's going to argue that he was just pursuing arbitrage, right? And again, it's a fine line. I don't really personally. I think that if what he did is criminal, then we have some work to do, because, like, ultimately all of DeFi and crypto is actually based around this idea of, like, incentive, and it relates to the Do Kwon thing as well, right? Because, like, part of the accusations against Do are that he, by trying to by doing market operations to hold the peg, that could actually be a form of market manipulation, right? But what he would say, and, like, actually the whole point of the mechanism is to incentivize people to move the price back to the peg, right? And so there is this difficult thing where we want to create these mechanisms that incentivize people to do stuff in the market that causes a certain outcome, but there is a fine line between responding to an incentive and manipulating the market, right? Both involve moving the price of an asset. We believe that if you're responding to the mechanism, you're responding in a positive way, and so that shouldn't be considered illegal market manipulation. But the laws don't really recognize the difference between good market manipulation and bad market manipulation, right? And so it'll be an interesting case if it's kind of fully litigated, to see how that's dealt with.
Interesting. All right. People who buy Miladies, prison.
No.
No. Okay.
Yeah, no. Miladies are, I mean, it's the most, Miladies are the new Bitcoin, right? It's like completely, there's no roadmap, right? I don't even know who the developers are. I mean, I own Miladies. I definitely am not, when I buy a Milady, I'm betting on, like, the, like, entire Milady community to generate value. And, like, you can't say that, like, the entire, like, Milady community needs to register as a securities issuer.
I
So yeah,
buy
I think they're
Miladies
pretty
with the
safe.
expectation of profit derived from third-party developers. So, Yes or no? Do we live in a simulation?
Which developers though?
Yeah.
Which developers? Do we live in a simulation? Yes, I actually do think we do live in a simulation.
You're in good
Yeah.
company. About 60% of crypto seems to think so. How about artificial intelligence? Yes or no? It's going to do whatever Eliezer Yudkowsky thinks it's going to do and kill everyone.
No.
Okay.
No.
Also in good company. Good stuff. I know you got a dog, so any last points, anything you want to plug, or any last things you want to talk about before I let you go? Let the dog take care of its business.
No, I'd say, make Borgs, use the Borg meme, and yeah, we're definitely in the and then they fight you stage, but I do see some very positive developments on the horizon, for crypto to ultimately be legal, and for it to thrive again. So yeah, don't completely succumb to despair.
If they try to fight us, resistance is futile.
That's right. Perfect.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to have you back on at some point because I've got several more hours of legal advice to get from you. But